Hey, welcome to the show. Today we've got a little light chatter about growing up in a cult. LaNisa Frederick is an award-winning actor, writer, content creator, and voiceover artist based in Los Angeles. You might have seen her on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, or you might recognize her voice from a Disney animation. And trust me, you have definitely seen her in at least one commercial. She's also a survivor of a doomsday cult called the Church of God. And she's about to start a comedic podcast and TV show about her experiences as a Black cult survivor. Yeah, you heard me right. I said comedic, which might surprise you, but it doesn't surprise me because I know LaNisa from acting school, and I know that she makes pretty much everything funny. In this episode, you're going to hear about the moments that she started to realize that her upbringing was like a little unusual. And we talk about what actually defines a cult. And the answer might surprise you. By the way, did you know that there are diet cults? LaNisa tells us about who gets involved in cults and why it's not just white person shit, as she says. She also talks about how Black and brown cult survivors aren't really talked about and why that might be the case. Finally, you are going to hear LaNisa tell us why compassion for people in cults and cult survivors is actually compassion for us all.
Breaking news. Your dream life isn't going to happen because you made a vision board. You're gonna need goals, grit, and some woo-woo shit. This podcast is about getting clarity on what you want, having the grit to do the actual work, and most importantly, constantly training your brain to be your bitch. Ready to be inspired? Here is your host, best-selling author, Una Duncan.
LaNisa, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk to you.
This is amazing, and it's been too long.
Totally. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey growing up in a doomsday cult? Light chatter.
Let's keep it light to start off. It's something that I'm honestly still getting used to saying out loud because it was something that there's a sense of shame with it. And I think especially, anybody that has been in any sort of high control group, there's a sense of shame, but there at the same time is a sense of needing to release. And honestly, the reality of me actually saying it made it true. And then as I did my research and talked to other people, I was like, no, this was a doomsday cult, y'all. But also seeing how other people responded to that. So long story short, I grew up in the Worldwide Church of God. Worldwide Church of God has been around since the 30s or 40s, started by Herbert W. Armstrong, who started off as a radio church leader. Back during that day, especially, you saw a lot of leaders come out west because the West was more, California was more open to that sort of thing. They started using media more. They started using this dynamic personality, hence why fast forward in the 80s, we had Jim Bakkers and we had Benny Hinn's. We had all these people that really use the dynamic use of media in order to get their Christian message across. So I was born into this church. I was born in a Worldwide Church of God. So I didn't know anything differently. This was my norm. I started as I got older to understand a few things, but the philosophy behind it was very much an Old Testament philosophy. And doomsday, meaning if you don't do this, the world is going to end on this date. He did give certain dates, which I was a kid, so didn't really know. I know that I have friends whose parents were in it, and they were told 1977, the world is going to end. It didn't end, but yet people still continue to be a part of it. It was a very much, I would say, financially arresting church in the sense that not only were there like tithes, there was the sense of that you had to give or you weren't going to be saved. And to be saved, you would have to be one of the people that gave properly, followed these rules, and then you would be able to go on a plane to Petra, Jordan, to be saved. Don't know how that was going to work. If the world is ending, how we getting on a plane to Jordan? So these were the things that as a kid, I started to be like, that don't make sense. I also have to say that I had one foot in and one foot out because my parents were married for 25 plus years. My dad passed, as you know, while I was living in England. And while he had us in it, my mom was not necessarily in the church. She would attend sometimes, so we would attend services sometimes, but she wasn't a full or a full member. So I would get snippets of being in it and out of it, and I could see it in a different way, I think, than people that were fully in it. For example, holidays. Holidays were a huge thing. We were not allowed to, we celebrated Old Testament Jewish holidays, which is why growing up, I just used to say I'm Jewish because I didn't know. I was like, I guess I'm a Jew. Because I celebrate Passover, because no one could explain to me where we fell in line. But holidays, for example, we didn't celebrate Christmas, yet my mom would sneak and my dad would go to work on Christmas Day. So my mom would sneak and bring out a Christmas tree. We'd quickly open presents and put them all back before my dad get home. Or Halloween, we knew we weren't allowed to celebrate. So I distinctly remember in kindergarten being pulled out of the holiday nasty cupcake party for, Halloween that we had, and sat in the corner with another guy that was also in the church. And we just watched everyone eat bad candy that we really wanted that, very badly, but it was a sin. We weren't allowed to celebrate. So holidays were a huge thing. I hope that answered some of what you asked.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many questions. So
Yes.
so just actually take me back to the Halloween party. You're watching everyone eat the cupcakes. You want the cupcakes, but it's a sin. Now, did you, as that child watching that, believe it was a sin, or you just believed I'm not supposed to do this? My family doesn't believe in it. I mean, what were your actual beliefs?
The latter. And also at 5, you're just like, well, why they get to eat cupcakes and I don't get to eat a cupcake? Why do I have to be sat in the corner? But I think at that point I did, start coming into my own of thinking like, my friend John that's eating a cupcake isn't going to hell because he ate a cupcake. So I think my 5-year-old brain was like, something ain't right. I didn't know how to articulate it, and I'm still working on that. But I knew that something was off kilter, which made me question more, which made me sometimes an outcast within the church, especially having a mom that was not fully in. So I was like, oh, she's that girl that, her dad's in it. She hangs with us, but I wasn't fully in like a lot of people were.
And so did you feel, was that safe, or did you feel like you were in danger either of going to hell or to being ostracized, or what were the consequences for not being fully involved in it?
I think the idea of being ostracized resonated more. Again, being that young, I couldn't articulate it. I didn't know what it meant. I thought I was doing good enough because we went to church on the Sabbath. We turned the TV off at sundown. We didn't eat pork. We celebrated all these holy days that we were told that we're good. So I followed along, but I did notice there being a difference because they knew that my mom wasn't in. So I don't know if a kid maliciously was trying to treat me a certain way, but I definitely could feel a difference because we weren't in 100% versus, people that were born into it, lived and died by the book. I was a little bit out. Like, I feel like also too, I might've been more of the rebel because I'd bring in these ideas that were different from what my friends were hearing. Since I had this outsider view, since I had someone else that, my mom that wasn't in it fully. So yeah, I would say more on the being ostracized versus safety. I think this is something to clarify too. Everyone has their, number one, the word cult is very difficult to explain. Everyone has their own definition.
I was just going to ask that. Yeah.
And I'm still working with that because honestly, anything could be a cult. Anything could be a cult. So I talked to an expert because I'm developing my own work based on it. And I talked to an expert and he said, honestly, the only thing that dictates what a cult is time and society. And I was like, wow, that's deep. He's like, some of the things that used to be seen as a cult have been accepted over time. So he's like, yes, obviously you have a charismatic leader that can dictate the will of the people that, you look at Jim Jones and like Jonestown. Yes, a charismatic leader that took control, blah, 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 blah. But in the beginning, he was just a regular normal leader. So that was accepted then. It's how his extreme beliefs then turned into death and destruction. But at the beginning, he was just a regular old preacher that was preaching anti-racist beliefs. So it's really a lot of like thinking about like how do you define cult, which is very difficult.
Yeah, well, let me just talk about the definition of a cult for a second, because I was like, yeah, what's the difference between a cult and just like a kooky religion that's like basically harmless? And I thought it was more that a cult, you are encouraged to separate yourself from your family, from it, and that there are consequences if you leave.
I personally do believe that. So I think the isolation is a huge part. But to the friend that who's an expert's point, he said a lot, even if you look over time, a lot of religions had that isolation belief because they're all trying to maintain membership. And then they realized that they had to loosen up in order to get more members. It wasn't going to work. So the difference is like with time right now, they're being isolated. If the religion succeeds, they might have to be less isolated because they need more members. Membership keeps it up. So you can't keep killing all your members, then you ain't gonna have none. So with time, you have to be able to open up, which is why he said, I see time being a huge factor within the definition of a cult. So if we look at immediate stuff now, like Nexium, if we look at, what was the other mother, the one that's a huge one where the lady was drinking silver and turning blue. That is definitely a high control group that isolated people, that took financial advantage of people that were vulnerable and put them in this situation. Now, eventually they would need to open up membership, and they can't do that by isolation. So then time plays a factor in it. And then eventually it might be seen as a normal thing. So I get what he's saying with time and being a factor.
Yeah. So you're saying any mainstream religion that we think of right now was probably a cult originally, but now it's just been around for so long and it's opened up its membership.
Everything was seen as weird. Catholicism couldn't have survived if it just stayed isolated. Catholicism would have to, had to be like, well, I guess I got to loosen up the reins or we go lose everybody. And we need this money.
And how do you feel when people toss the word cult around like, oh my God, my CrossFit gym is such a cult?
It's difficult in several ways because I'm very guilty of it too. I have been guilty of it. We do that for a lot of words. We take the language and we use it in ways that don't necessarily mean what it means, but we don't understand the thing behind it. I don't know. Language, that's a tricky one. Language is very tricky because, again, language depends on time. Like, at what time is this appropriate? Can we be more aware? Absolutely. Which is why I would love to bring more awareness, especially to people of color that have been victims and survived cults, because that's something that we don't talk about. Everybody talk about the white people that survived the cult, but I'm like, yo, we here too. We are present and accounted for.
Yeah.
So it's hard.
I want to ask about that because I know your new podcast, Black and Cultivated, is going to really focus on the experience of Black and brown people who are cult survivors. So in your experience in the Church of God where you grew up, what percentage of your community was Black?
So this is really interesting because people are like, how did you grow up in a white supremacist church with all the folks Black? And what I mean by that is, if you look at the tenets of Armstrongism, a lot of them had questions like, what do we do? Literally, I've been doing research. What do we do with our Negro brethren? They highly believed that interracial marriage was a sin, things like that. So how do Black folks end up like that? We were not the only Black folks in the church. In my congregation alone, I would say it was 40% Black, 60% white. That's pretty huge, like pretty equal numbers. Same with other places. The Worldwide Church of God really was worldwide. There were in London. When I moved to England, my dad was like, oh, I think we know some members over there. So it was a very worldwide church after a while. Why? Because you got to open it up so you could keep getting money and getting membership. You can't keep isolating.
In your congregation, you said, okay, all these Black people are here because they didn't read the charter. That's basically a racist charter. But was the experience that you had growing up, were the Black people treated differently than the white people in your community?
As a kid, again, I was born into it, and around, I would say by the time I left high school is when I was like, I'm out. Deuces. maybe I'll come back once or twice in between, college years. As a kid, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on what wasn't right, but I was like, something's not right. And my mom will even say, I kept telling him that those people were not treating Black people right. My dad, meaning my dad, I kept telling him that something wasn't right. Talking to I also think that there was a camaraderie and a community within the Black congregation at my church. But one thing I would notice is when we would go to another congregation, I always felt weird. Because in those congregations, then I was the one or two Black folks. And I was like, why in my congregation is it like all Black? And then all these other ones, it's all white, and they look at us weird when we walk in. I'm like, we're in the same church, guys. We believe in the same bullshit. I'm like, why is that? So I couldn't put my finger on it as a kid, but I knew something wasn't right. And I also heard things. So you had a lot of older white church members that would make comments about if somebody was dating interracially. Like, oh, that's not right. Glenn Washington, again, I'm going to use him as an example. He talks about the time, because we would have dances since we weren't allowed to go to school or, Christmas dances and stuff, that he was dancing with another white girl in his church, and an older member pulled him aside and said, we don't do that here. I talked to a Black member, older Black member, elder of my church, when I interviewed her, and she said, yeah, that was very weird. She was at a singles dance, and she danced with one of the white members, and somebody pulled her aside and said, we don't do that here. You can't do that.
Yeah. Hold on 1 second, LaNisa. if people are listening to this and they can't see LaNisa, she's not like 80 years old. We're talking like this is in the 90s.
Right.
Like, when you're hearing about Black and white students being pulled apart at dances,
right.
Like this happened recently. Yeah. So I did some research on this too. And so I was on the Reddit forum Black Ladies, and I was on a thing about cults and Black people in cults. And it's so interesting. I think all people, when they think of cults, a lot of people think of, Jim Jones and the People's Temple and the Jonestown Massacre. So I didn't realize until I started researching for this interview that although Jones was white, most of his followers were Black. And that forum on Reddit said that it was actually considered a safe haven for racial inclusion, because in the 50s, it had all these kind of socialist advantages like free childcare, that was really appealing to Black people who at the time had very little economical and political power. And so this is really enticing. So I was wondering, and then there was also some other cults mentioned that really had Black empowerment as a central tenet of the cult. So I was wondering, LaNisa, do you think that Black people might be especially vulnerable to these communities?
I think anybody is vulnerable. I think that specifically speaking, not for all Black folk, but speaking for just saying in general, I do think that there is, especially here, talking about in the US, here in America, there is a vulnerability to find a belonging when you've been excluded for so long, whatever that might look like. Maybe it is a religious cult. Maybe it is whatever that is. I think there is a specific vulnerability. Same reason why I think we see a lot of women that fall victim and prey to this as well. Like when you're ostracized in society in another way, you are seeking that. You brought up great example with Jonestown and Jim Jones, and we don't talk about the victims as much. We hear about Jim Jones, but I'm like, yeah, but like 80% of the people that got killed were Black people, women, and children. And they were seeking that. It was pre-civil rights movement. And here comes this guy saying like, hey, I acknowledge that the world is racist. Let's all come together and I got your back. Which is so scary because that's so enticing.
Which is really appealing.
It's so appealing.
Absolutely.
I do think there is a possibility to be have more vulnerability as a result of the society around you.
Yeah. So that brings me to, do you think that there's a stereotype about cult survivors that you would want to bust?
Yeah, absolutely. I just talked to somebody about this the other day. You must be predispositioned to be easily manipulated. And I don't think that's the case. Nobody goes into a cult saying, I want to be part of a cult. Nobody goes in and says, I'd like to give up all of my financial freedom. You go into it because you're looking for belonging. You think you find a group. You feel safe. It feels trusted. And then slowly they chip away at your individuality with rules, with, things like that make you all of a sudden wake up and you're in a cult. So I think the biggest stereotype that I would like to break, especially when talking about Black folks that have been victim to it, is that it's a possibility for anyone. And it doesn't make someone less or more smart. I mean, look, everybody that was in my church was smart as hell. My dad was a phlebotomist. He worked in hematology at a hospital. My mom was a teacher. Somebody I just interviewed, she also was, she's a scientist. Nobody's dumb. It's that idea. And nobody goes into it like, oh, I have to be in a cult. They go into it wanting belonging and seeking belonging.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what do you think? You said earlier that, no one's doing a 6-part Netflix series about Black and brown cult survivors. The imagery that we see is almost exclusively white. And why do you think that is? Why do you think these stories are not reflected in all the cult talk, which I feel is kind of like a very sexy conversation to have these days, right? A lot of people are talking about cult stuff.
Exactly. It's a very sexy conversation. And when you think of the sexy things, the image that especially with Western media has is this white image of things. Let's look at how missing Black and brown children are portrayed, or Black and brown women are portrayed versus missing white girls, the missing white girl syndrome that was actually named as a result of this. So it's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing.
Wait, can you explain missing white girl syndrome if no one's familiar with that?
And I'm not going to do it justice at all, but essentially missing white girl syndrome is the idea that if you're white, you're going to get twice as much, 3 times as much attention from the media in order to solve your case. I can't think of rest in peace of the girl that was found. Her boyfriend had ended up murdering her. There was a huge thing during the pandemic. I can't think of her name, but at the same time, there were Gabby, see? I remembered her name there. Gabby Patino, forgive me if I'm not saying it correctly. Huge. The minute that the news dropped, every podcast had an episode about her. Every news outlet had, a special announcement about her, that update. And even her folks said, I hope the attention that she got, we can share this with other people that don't get enough attention. I hope that this tragedy at least raises awareness that she's not the only one. And just because she was a beautiful blonde girl, that she should not be the only one. So the missing white girl syndrome is the idea that you gotta give more attention. White girls are given more attention than missing indigenous people, which we know is huge with missing Black and brown people as well. So that said, same thing relates to cults. Same thing.
Right. The Black and brown victims of cults are not getting as much airtime. And you're saying that actually the experience of Black and brown people in cults and why they might be more vulnerable, maybe that's a different experience.
Yeah.
It's a whole different story that's not being told. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's a different story because it comes from a different origin. There's a different origin of maybe the why. Now, trust, I've watched every cult documentary that's been hot and sexy for the past 3 years. You name it, everything. I have watched it all. I was obsessed with the NXIVM thing. I was obsessed with all of it. And while every one of those people in there are definitely victims, I can see the origin being different. There is another dynamic that I don't think that we discuss because within our own community, that's some white shit. So then there's a level of shame with it. And I put quotes for, if you're listening, I put quote unquote, that's some white shit. Because that is a narrative that we're often heard. Like, oh, those white people are crazy. They joined blah, blah, blah. So then, meanwhile, someone that's Black or brown that has experienced it, they devoid themselves of that experience because, oh no, well, one, I don't want to be ashamed of what I've done or shamed for what I've done. And two, maybe that really wasn't me. But in reality, it's like, no, you went through some shit too. And it's okay to talk about it as well. So, yeah, I think there are different origins. I think it all still comes from wanting to belong.
It's interesting you say that within the Black and brown community, there's this, oh, that's some white shit about being a cult victim. And it's funny because it's like the overlapping of kind of race stereotypes with stereotypes about cult victims, right? And they're just kind of overlapping in a way that is making it a very particular white experience. And you're saying there is a very particular Black experience, but that experience is not being told.
Yeah, it's not being told. And even, for my example, the cult that I was, the Doomsday Church cult, whatever you want to call it, that I was in, it was white led. So we don't talk about my boyfriend who's white said, wait, are there Black cults? Like he asked, I'm like, yeah. So, and that's definitely not talked about. There is a case right now where I want to say it's in the South. I can't exactly remember that a few women have come out and said, hey, my daughter's missing. They went off to follow this leader who was very like an Afrocentric extremist. And we think that they're in a cult. Is it getting much news? It's not at all. It's not at all. And that's considered a Black, quote unquote, led cult. So I think there's a lot of them that, a lot of people don't know. And there's a lot of denial.
Mm-hmm. How would you say that? So when you were growing up, you were told that there was a imminent doomsday. And you said maybe you were told the date, but you don't really remember because you were a kid because it meant nothing to you. And you were told that those that were, saved, that were part of the church would go on a plane to Petra, Jordan, and would therefore be saved. And you also had to tie the significant portion of your income and give it to the church. Is that were there any other ways that you felt controlled or that had a negative impact on you growing up?
I definitely would say, obviously, we talked a little bit about the holidays and like what that meant. But there were also things that I think that were a lot of gender based as well. And there are people that definitely have more experiences than me because I was so young growing in it. But the idea of what your wifely duties were, your ideal of these gender roles, the ideas of like beauty, even. I remember there was a point we came in and all of a sudden we weren't allowed to wear pants. And maybe it was gradual, but in my, teenage, preteen years, it was like, boom, you can't wear pants to church anymore. You're a woman. Or I distinctly remember coming in, being told you can't wear makeup anymore, going to the bathroom, and the bathrooms were all boarded with like, what's it called? That brown, like construction paper. Because we weren't allowed to. Now, keep in mind, we held services, my congregation held services at a VFW, which meant somebody had to come in early, tape up the mirrors, and then take it down at the end of the day. I was like, that sounds like a lot of effort. So the idea that by the time
I don't know what a VFW is.
Oh, it's a veterans hall. So they're everywhere. I'll explain. So a VFW
okay.
are like veterans halls that are scattered all around the country. It's like a meeting place for vets, but they rent it out so they could keep, so they could pay for it. So it's very normal to like rent out a VFW for events. And this is where we had our church every week. So I remember going in and there says brown construction paper on the mirrors. And I'm like, what happened now? What? And they're like, you can't look in the mirror because it's vain. I'm like, what? I felt like every day there was like a new rule being created. Like, we got to do this now.
I actually knew a little bit about this because I don't know if you remember this. When you and I were in Spain together, I remember us sitting somewhere and you were doing a lot of processing about your origins and stuff at the time because your dad had just passed. And you said, is it normal for people to cover up the mirrors? And I went, I've never heard of that. And you were like, huh.
Really?
Do you remember that?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wild. That's absolutely wild. Wow.
Yeah. So
wow.
I mean, it was a weird trip. We were doing lots of lots of processing, but yeah. And so I wonder. It sounds like the awareness of the kind of weirdness trickled in. It sounds like you got some little pings of like, oh, that's a bit weird. That's a bit weird. And then even, am I wrong to say even now, maybe you're starting to reflect on certain things and being like, oh, that was kind of fucked up too, actually.
Absolutely. And I think it's for several reasons. It's because my church didn't end up, thank God, in a Waco, Jonestown, Heaven's Gate ending, right? So if it's not that extreme, you think it's okay. A lot of times people think, oh, it's fine. Well, you didn't die. You're okay. But so I think a lot of the processing and everything trickled in because it didn't go to that extreme. But there were still extremes that happened that obviously affected me and other people. I know of a member that was forced into gay conversion therapy. I was not aware of that during my time, but they condoned it. My church condoned gay conversion therapy, and they sent people away on that I wasn't aware of. So I think it's like that trickle down effect of like, oh, that happened? Wait, that happened to you? And also talking to former members and talking to people that were in it. I kind of, as I'm working on how to organize my own podcast for it, I think I'm trying to rate cults in a certain way. So maybe something is like diet cult or a cult light versus like a Molly girl you need to run cult. Because they all are they all are dangerous in their own way. It's just to what extreme are they dangerous, and what does that look like?
Can you talk about that
on?
about something that people don't think is that dangerous? Like you mentioned, a diet cult, which I'm guessing a lot of listeners of this podcast have probably dipped their toes in one of those. Can you talk about why that might be a little bit more insidious than we think?
Yeah, I mean, Gwen Shamblin is a great example, The Way Down, and that's the big diet cult. I think that was on Netflix as well. So that's a huge thing that people are in pop culture have heard about, this idea that you have to be skinny for Jesus. Which, and
what?
its
I've never heard of this.
Are you serious? Oh my God. Look up Gwen Shamblin and her hair.
I need to hear everything about this.
It's wild. And watch the documentary. It's wild. But she made mad money on her cult. And it was essentially you have to be skinny for Jesus. And look, yes, a lot of people were affected in huge, huge ways. But at its basis, it just sounds like a church that's trying to get you healthy, right? It's a church that is trying to care for your whole being, which sounds beautiful. And if you weren't affected to the full extent, you can still be like, yeah, I did that. It was fine. And I left. But I also have to think about the people that didn't get to leave and that were affected financially or with eating disorders or things like that. So it runs the gambit. You know, you might have something that's a light cult, what feels quote unquote light culty, but you just don't know how it can affect every person.
Right. Okay. So now this is what I want. So we talked about all the ways that cults are pretty fucked up. They're going to fuck you up. And your upcoming podcast and your show that you're writing about this is a comedy. So tell us what is funny about growing up in a cult.
Because this shit is wild. This shit's hilarious. It's so wild. This is where I come from. I come from comedy. You know, my career has been based in comedy, be it improv or sketch or what I do. Yeah, we both know we are theatrically, classically trained, but I did the comedy route. I'm a huge believer that you laugh from keep from crying, and laughter is a source of healing. There is a beautiful documentary that talks about the history of comedy within the Black community and talks about how we've taken so much of the things that were painful and used comedy for it. And we, Black folks, we will laugh loud, very, very loud, because we use it as a source of healing. And I truly take that to heart and believe it, which is why, and I also believe that comedy has not only the ability to heal, but the ability to teach in a different way. I don't want a show or a podcast that is like downtrodden and just like by the end you're crying all the time. Like, that's too much. And I feel like we tune out after a while with that. I want something that you can laugh and then reflect. So that's why both the series that I'm writing called Church Candy is a comedy, is a single cam comedy, as well as I'm utilizing the podcast Black and Cultivated as a comedy podcast about cults. Is it going to be hard to find a balance? I think it absolutely will. Will I offend people? Probably. But I do, at the heart of it, I truly believe that laughter is a source of healing, and I'm going into it with great intentions. Am I going to interview people that I feel are like still in the midst of things and they need some other type of therapy? No, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. So I think I'm going to be responsible in ensuring that the guests that I have on, we can talk about it in a way that doesn't re-traumatize, because that's not my goal, in a way that we find humor in the absurdity of what we've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I want to take this portion of what I just said to you and use it in a
Good.
pitch. So I'm gonna
Amazing.
take that back when I
I will send you
I was
the
like, that
recording.
sounded good.
Yeah, man, it sure did.
So the premise of Church Candy is 13-year-old Lena is coming to her own and is starting to realize some things are not quite right about the church she's in. She develops a crush, as one does then, and the boy asked her to a Valentine's Day dance, which is like the worst sin that can happen. Like, you can't go to dances, you can't dance with these boys. Valentine's Day is like the ultimate no in her church, in her fictitious church, because the church that I created in this series is a mix of a lot of different things. Lena does sneak off to go to church, and because this is set in the 90s, or to go to the dance, Lena does set off and sneak to go to the dance. And she gets to the dance, and I have one of my favorite scenes is her coming in, and it looks like Sodom and Gomorrah. So she's like, teachers are drunk and children are humping, and like, it looks like hell, and because that's what she's been told. And then the smoke clears and she just sees like a whole bunch of kids dancing to TLC and drinking punch. And she jumps in, and eventually, like, she listens to all this secular music in this. There is her really good friend that it starts to show her another way, similar to what I had. So she starts asking her friend, like, "Hey, is it normal that I'm not allowed to do X, Y, and Z?" And her friend's like, "No, that's kind of weird. What church do you go to?" So I think just it's a coming of age, and the literally coming of age within this Valentine's Day dance, where I get to incorporate so much 90s stuff, which I'm obsessed with. She dances to Boys to Men with like another student there. So that's one of my favorite scenes, being able to see her blossom and come alive in this series.
Oh, that sounds so good. I'm so pumped for you. That's awesome. LaNisa, I know people are going to want to see that. They're going to want to tune into Black and Cultivated. And oh my gosh, especially if you are an actor or have ever done any acting, you will definitely want to follow LaNisa on Instagram, because she's got a whole other thing called #booked, which is Actor's Life, which is absolutely hilarious. So LaNisa, tell everybody where they can keep in touch with you and this project, which is so cool.
Yes. So I'm big on IG, at LaNisa Frederick. That's my personal one. And also at #booked, which you mentioned. And hashtag is spelled out. And that's definitely a slice of actor's life that we've turned into sketches. So yes, those are my main platforms on IG.
Awesome. And LaNisa, any final words? What do you want in doing all of this content about cults, about your experience, about the Black and Brown experience in cults? Like, what do you want everyone to know? If you could shout something from the mountaintops with the bullhorn, what are you trying to get across with all the work you're doing on this?
Breathe and have grace, not only for yourself, but for whoever's sitting next to you. Because as I mentioned before, I think we started recording, we are one little blip on this long journey of the universe. So let us breathe and have grace and understand each other's story.
Beautiful. I love that. I love that. That's great. LaNisa, thank you so much for coming on the show. I love talking to you.
I want to talk to you all the time. This is amazing.
Well, my friend, there you have it. I hope you found LaNisa's story interesting. I was really struck by the idea from LaNisa's cult expert friend that anything could be a cult. And the only thing that dictates what a cult is time and society. I'm going to have to think about that one. And I'm absolutely going to look into that crazy diet cult. That sounds absolutely wild. Let me know what's got you stroking your beard after this episode. I love hearing what gets you thinking. So leave a review or reach out at Una Duncan on Instagram, and I'll see you next week. Hey dude, thanks for listening. If you like this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you can get the next one. And by the way, if you rate and review this podcast, it really helps me get found by other people who need some goals, grit, and some woo-woo shit. And be sure to connect and DM me at Una Duncan on Instagram and let me know what you thought of the episode. Chat soon.